Hi, Misha here, and we've already looked at some Russian armored cars. We've looked at some early light tanks like the T-18 and T-26. And going back, we talked about armored infantry fighting vehicles like the BMP and BMD. This is all to say, in a way it all connects. So today I want to talk about a series of light tanks in Russia that in some ways were very ambitious and in other ways were considered death traps. So I have four laid out here, all very similar in a lot of ways. These are all two-man tanks, considered light tanks or scout tanks. They're all 1/72 scale diecast from Fabry. Here we have the T-38. Here is the T-40. Both of these are actually amphibious. And in theory, air transportable, air droppable even. Moving on, we get to the T-60, not to be confused with the T-40S or T-4060. Yeah, that's a thing. And then finally, the last in the series, and one of the last Russian light tanks, at least until the Cold War, we have the T-70. Interesting progression, and in total, a lot were built before and during World War II. So were they worth it? Or were they really a coffin for two brothers, as the Soviets kind of coined it? Let's find out. The T-38. This was actually the second in the series, an improvement on the T-37A. And the T-37A is famous in history for being the world's first mass-produced, full production, fully developed amphibious tank. Before that, nothing really happened. Now, it was actually based on a design by Vickers called the Amphibious tank or tankette, but this was more of a concept, a prototype. When I did the video on the T-35, a couple of people commented that the Independent was a multi-turret tank and yada yada compared to the T-35. The thing is, the Independent was never put into full production. It was only produced one or two prototypes, and much the same with the Vickers design. But it inspired Russian designers at Factory 37 near Moscow. They took the Vickers and between 1931 and 1932 designed what will become the T-37A. It was always meant to be a scout tank, a reconnaissance tank, with some infantry support abilities, also for communications. And it was supposed to be able to ford rivers, maybe some lakes, although it was never meant for open water, of course. But it had issues. Would it surprise you to learn that some had to do with transmission? That seems to have been an ongoing thing with Russian armor throughout history. So, some transmission things. Also, it was built to use gasoline engines, something that would continue. They were kind of actually based on a Ford type of engine. It also had problems with sinking. Kind of not desirable in an amphibious tank. It couldn't carry much cargo, and it could easily get swamped and flooded and go under. They used quark to try to keep it up, but it didn't really work. And it had a propensity when on land for the tracks to fall off. So yeah, the 37 had some issues. So in 1934, work began on an improved version. And initially it was just going to be another 37 model, maybe 37B or whatever. But in the end, they ended up doing enough redesign work that it became this one here, the T-38 Light Amphibious Scout Tank. Now, it weighs about 3.3 tons, whereas the previous 37 was about 3.2. So it's actually a very light tank, all things considered. They did make it slightly longer. It's about 3.8 meters versus 3.7, but really they made the body wider. It's about 3.3 meters wide, and they reworked a few things. They moved the positions because these had a crew of 2. You have a driver, and then in the turret, which is a 1-person turret, you have a commander who also doubles as the gunner and the gun loader. So quite a bit going on. So with the original designs, the driver was on the left and the gunner on the right. They flipped this because of right side driving. For amphibious duties, it's got a propeller in the back here, relatively exposed, 3-bladed. It can also use its tracks in shallow water to help propel it. It was pretty lightly armored. Both the 37 and the 38 had only a max armor of about 9 millimeters. But for the day and time, they were quite fast, between 35 and 40 kilometers per hour. And on water, about 4 kilometers, maybe 5 with a good current. So, what are we armed with here? Not much armor. Well, not much gun either. It has one Diktarev DT machine gun, which is 7.62 by 54R. Both models carried just under 600 rounds, and that was it. And they weren't stupid. In development of the T-38, they did experiment with adding a 20 millimeter automatic cannon, which was coming into use on aircraft, and that would be controlled by the driver. But during testing, it was just proven that it was a distraction for the driver. It was mounted in the hull, so it couldn't really be aimed, took up space, made the driving compartment more cramped. It just wasn't worth the weight penalties. From what I've been able to determine, this version was sometimes called the T-38T. It should also be noted that the T-38 was not fitted with a radio, at least not in the beginning. So they would work on this design, improving things, and the first prototype would appear in the summer of 1935 and go through testing and trials. In 1936, T-37A production would be halted, and T-38 production would start up in its place. And also that year, there would be some military maneuvers around Kiev, where these were actually strapped to the underside of Antonov bombers, showing that they could be air-ported. Again, they were only 3.3 tons, so it doesn't sound like this was terribly successful, but in concept, it could be done. In 1937, the T-38 would enter Red Army service officially. But interestingly, production would halt that year. They would produce them in 36 and 37. Now, they had built around 1,200 T-37As, and at this point, they had built under 1,250 T-38s, so they served alongside together. Now, while there was a lull in production in 1938, in 1939, they would do another run of about 110 of these, bringing production up to just around 1,350, meaning total production for both models was around 2,500. I'm just rounding, to give you something. And they would first see combat in 1939 in Poland and be used in Finland, where the shortcomings were made quite apparent. Now, these used rolled steel armor for lightweight, which successful enough, but also didn't really protect against much. Even some small arms fire in Finland could penetrate at relatively close ranges, and it had no real protection against any kind of cannon. On top of that, it wouldn't surprise you to learn that the 7.62 machine gun was, it was a machine gun. So basically, it was a mobile machine gun nest. Additionally, the commander still had a lot going on, being the gun loader, aimer, commander, and not having a radio. Now, in 1937, they would do a series called the T-38RT, which did have a radio, but these were usually only kind of lead tanks. Typically, an infantry battalion would have 38 of these issued, and an airborne battalion, paratroopers, would have 50, so they were used by both. They were used for infantry support, scouting, communications, yada yada. But even though they improved its buoyancy, like the T-37, the T-38 really couldn't carry any cargo if a couple of soldiers tried to jump on the back, because that's a lot of times how the Red Army worked. Infantry would ride into battle on the back of armored. If it had more than 100 up to 150 kilograms added to it, it would also start to go low in the water and then get swamped and then also sink. So, yeah, not great. At least the tracks weren't falling off. But it certainly had shortcomings. Therefore, yeah, 1939 was the last production year. And they didn't do great in Finland. They kind of got owned there. So by the time of the Germans in 1941, the T-37s and T-38s that were around were basically just used for delaying action. Some of them were even dug in and turned into basically pillboxes, machine gun nests. And by 1942, that was really about it. You didn't see a lot of them in service. By the way, as you saw, the turret does move on this. Kind of neat. Rubber tracks. There were a couple of river crossings they were famous for mid-war, but by late 43, they were relegated to second-line duties. They actually were pretty good tractors and towing vehicles, all things considered. So the Russians and Germans that captured them put them into service as that. But by 1944, that was pretty much it. Most of them were gone or broken down. So kind of the end there. The few that remained, interestingly, both 37s and 38s, were fitted with 20mm cannon again. About 120 were. And this became kind of the last variant. I'm not sure exactly why they did it at this point, other than why not. So that was kind of the last little gasp of this tank or tankette. And with the end of World War II, they were pulled from Red Army service. But this was only the beginning. Meet the T-40. This is a much larger tank, although still very much a light tank. Because it was very apparent that the 37 and 38 needed replacing and more modernization. Something that the Red Army was doing a lot of with its vehicles in the late 30s. So in 1939-1940, design work began. And by 1941, this was put into production. The Red Army still wanted amphibious vehicles, but more capable, more powerful gun, more armor. You get the idea by now. This is about a 6-ton tank. It's about 4.1 meters long, so a little longer, a little bigger. Still a crew of 2. But we have improved the armor. It goes up to 13mm, so about a 50% increase. We have a new turret. It's the new conical design. And we have a new, more streamlined, more quote-unquote boat-shaped hull. And all of this, it's all welded versus being riveted together on earlier designs. They also improved the propeller in the back, kind of recessing it and closing it to protect it better, just make it more efficient. Now this is still powered by a gasoline engine from Gaz. It's a little bit faster at about 45 kilometers per hour on land, about 5 kilometers in water. It can ford rivers and some lakes and other freshwater bodies, that kind of thing. But its notable thing, it has improved armament. Now don't get too excited, we're not getting to cannons yet, but we do have a 12.7 millimeter, which is basically 50 caliber, DSHK or Mishaco machine gun. So quite a bit more capable than a 30 cal. And we still retain the 7.62 DT machine gun. So we have two guns now, both used by the commander. It really was a step forward in pretty much every way. And it was just getting into production in 1941 when Germans. Now, it gets interesting. If you look at sources, they say about 1,000 were made, 950, 960, 1,000. But nearly 600 of these were actually a variant known as the T40-60 or the T40S or even the T40, T30. These were basically non-amphibious versions, but we'll talk about those more in a minute. Actual true T40s here, they only built about 360, including prototypes. The little propeller in the back. Oh, one other thing. The earlier versions used coil spring suspension. These actually use a more modern torsion bar. So, yeah, better, more modern suspension. Just overall, a more modern construction. Made, again, with welding. A bit of sloped armor. We have kind of that conical turret design that was pretty prevalent for Red Army vehicles in the late 30s, early 40s, before the war. Just a beefier tank. But not many were produced. They were used, of course, to delay the Germans in 1941. Not a whole lot survived 1942. And those that did were pretty much relegated to second line service. And by 1944-45, the remaining ones were sent to schools for training. And they would last there for students until 1946. The Red Army was doing a lot of changes with light tanks and amphibious things at this time. But this was one of the few amphibious capable tanks featured in World War II. And it was a step forward. But it was also, well, when you're defending against Germans, you don't really need all that. And it was too expensive to mass produce. And of course, factories were being relocated in 1941. So that leads us to our next series, which the names really do get a little confusing on. The T-60 Light Tank. This is really where the name a grave or a coffin for two brothers gets coined. So, let's go back in time just a wee bit to 1938-1939. The Design Bureau at Factory 37 had two designs, the T-30A and the T-30B. The T-30A would be turned into the T-40. It was an amphibious tank. The T-30B was meant for ground only and was meant to be easier to mass produce and to have a little more armor, capability. More of a traditional light tank to replace like the T-26. But nothing much happened with the T-30B. That is until Germans. Of course, right after Operation Barbarossa began, Russia began suffering major losses of armor. And they needed to replace losses as much as they could. Of course, T-34 production was only beginning, and they were still working out the bugs. KV-1 production wasn't much better, and the design still had its weaknesses. They needed anything they could do, producing where they could. So in only 15 days, the first design was offered, sometimes called the T-40-60 or the T-40S. They essentially took the T-40 and removed the propeller and a few other changes. and it was more heavily armored, but not more heavily armed. It was still too expensive to produce, but it would be produced for a short time in 1941. This is where the roughly 600 kind of come into play. But they needed something cheaper and easier to be produced, basically something that could be built in any factory, not just a tank factory, but anywhere. Shipyards, aircraft factories, truck factories, heck, motorcycle factories, whatever, maybe doghouse factories. So the design team, still at Factory 37, would revisit the T-30B, and this is where the true T-60 comes into play here. Now, really, since it's kind of the same basic design, it uses the same chassis, the same drivetrain, the same engine. So size and weight-wise, it's pretty similar, about 4.1 meters, roughly 45 kilometers per hour. Still a crew of 2. But it is up armored. The 1941 version had up to 20 millimeter front armor plating, and even the sides and whatnot were improved. They also went to a new hexagonal 8-sided shaped turret. This gave a few advantages. For one, it was faster and easier to mass produce. It could be plates welded together versus the conical style. But for another, it did allow more armament. Again, the T-40 just had the 7.62 machine gun and the 12.7 millimeter machine gun. And originally, in the summer of 1940, they were going to roll with that same layout. But right before the T-60 went into production as such, government officials wanted to upgun it to that 20 millimeter automatic cannon that had been toyed with earlier on. With the new turret design, it could be installed, still retaining the 7.62 gun. And this really gained traction. They were mass producing these 20 millimeter guns, so the guns and ammo were readily available. Made sense. It gave it a little more hitting power, a little more range. So there were state trials in 1941, September. Actually, Stalin was there, at least for the final versions, and really was taken with the tank. And in fact, he signed an order immediately requesting, demanding it's Stalin. Who am I kidding? Stalin never requests anything. 10,000 tanks. And so it was prominently shown in the October Revolution Parade that year, and was ramped up for full production, except Factory 37 and many others were being relocated to the Urals. So, who to build these? Enter Gaz, the truck factory. They scaled back truck production in 1941 so they could build T-60 tanks, because these could be built in many places. And even though they got a late start, they produced over 1,300 that first year. And then once it was up and running, Factory 38, Kirov, would build these as well, and many other factories too. They were using common engine, common gun. They did not require a lot of resources. They actually were a little bit lighter than the T-40, about 5.8 tons versus nearly 6. Even though they had the heavier armor, removing all that of the equipment. They also went to a simpler hull design, but it still wasn't great. Actually, in 1942, they would improve the armor plating, at least in the front, up to 35 millimeters, but they never really improved the engine, so this did make the later versions, while better armor protected, it made them a little sluggish, slower to turn, maneuverability was down, and top speed took a longer time to reach, if not outright decreased. Neat little design, but keep in mind, 20 or 35 millimeter armor protection, 40 to 45 miles per hour top speed, which is pretty good, but not screaming. And just a 20mm cannon, by the way, it carried about 750 rounds for it, so at least a good supply. And again, no radio as standard on these, just to save time. And it was going up against Panzers. This is where the death trap thing kind of comes in. It was essentially a spam tank. Before video games, this was Russia's spam tank. They could produce them quickly. They only required 2 men to operate, and probably die in, frankly. But they were fielded, and it gave them something they could crank out. And if it got close to an armor, especially shooting on the side, it might be able to do something with the 20mm cannon. It did have a relatively low profile, so that kind of worked in its favor, and it was relatively quiet running. That worked in its favor, but those were about the only things. These were rushed into production, manufacturing was rushed, and it showed, and hundreds and soon thousands were lost in the fight against the Germans. But every time they had to stop to take out a T-60, well, it delayed them. And time was what Russia needed to relocate and restart production in 1942. So, better than nothing is about the best you can say for the T-60. This is why its production was relatively brief. If I can press the button. So already by 1942, work was underway to try and upgun this. They considered the 37mm cannon used on the earlier tanks. This would fit into the turret, but they weren't really being used a whole lot. Ammo was kind of short, everything. It didn't really work out, and it wasn't enough of an improvement to really warrant it. Still couldn't really penetrate armor, even the high-velocity version. Next, they would consider a 45mm gun, but that would require a new turret. But work would proceed, and that will get us to our final tank today in just a minute. But it was pretty meh. Not especially fast, not all that maneuverable. Weak gun, not great armor, even the later versions. So production was ordered to be suspended, discontinued in the late part of 1942. But by that year, they had built nearly 5,400 of these from several factories. Quite a substantial number. And then at the beginning of 1943, another 55 would be built using leftover existing parts, making the production run officially from 1941 to 1943. But that's a little misleading. It was only really more like a year and a half production run. And by 1943, these were pretty much pulled from frontline services, and more T-34s became available. They would still be used for convoy escort duties, artillery unit support, a little bit of reconnaissance, although not the fastest thing in the world for that, and of course training and guard duties in the second line areas. And there were plenty to go around in 1944, but as soon as the war ended in 1945, the not beloved, okay, let's be honest, it was pretty well hated and dreaded, T-60 was pulled from Red Army service, so it didn't make it past the war. But, again, 5,400 tanks can't be sneezed at, and that really helped replace the losses and bought Russia time until better, more capable armor could come along. It really was better than nothing. And it would lead to our final light tank today. In 1942, as relocation of the factories was well underway and nearly complete, and as the at least initial onslaught was being at least stalemate, the Red Army determined that its existing light tanks were just not up to snuff. They couldn't keep up with faster units, and they couldn't penetrate virtually any German armor. Something needed to happen. But on the other hand, light tanks could be mass-produced, required very little resources to make, and required very little human resources to crew, so they didn't want to give up on light tanks altogether. Now, like I said with the T-60, they would work on upgunning it, including a new turret for it. And this would really be the genesis of the T-70. The idea behind it was to give it more firepower and better armor protection, also better cross-country off-road performance. The T-60 could often be stymied by snow or mud. Yeah, things that, you don't at all find in Russia, right? So they would work with the new turret, had a little more room inside, still a single-person turret, but had more room, still made from welded together armored plates. But now we have a true anti-tank gun, 45 caliber, but it is high velocity. Now it only carries 45, maybe 50 shells on board, but better to have that small number of shells at work than 750 that don't. And it also retained the 7.62 DT machine gun for support, protection. It was about the same, a little bit longer at about 4.3 meters. Still two-man crew, still had a gasoline engine. Now, interestingly, it used 2 gas engines instead of 1. Now, the first versions, known as T-70, had an engine on each side, essentially one engine powering each track. This was a horrible idea for so many reasons. So instead, they moved all the engines, both of them, over here in a tandem position and line, so they worked together. And this was officially known as the T-70M, but since the original T-70 was basically not produced outside prototypes and pre-production, they're all just known as T-70s. So, it would enter into production around September of 1942, although some prototypes date all the way back to that spring. And its biggest advantage probably was its armor. It had up to 60 millimeter front armor, so double that of the up-armored T-60 and triple that of the original T-60. This, while still not super thick, was enough to at least take a hit at range. And it still was about 45 kilometers per hour, and because of the 2 engines, did have better acceleration, better maneuverability, and again, wouldn't get stuck in snow and mud near as often. And even though it still only has a 2-man crew, at least the commander has a little more elbow room in his turret. And a few other things were improved as well, like range and overall construction. In almost every way, it was a vast improvement, but it was still a light tank. But these were put into mass production at Factory 38, at Gauss, and other places. And they built the crap out of the T-70, especially considering it was really only in production about a year. As more T-34s, and especially T-34-85s, became available, the Red Army reevaluated its use of light tanks in September, October of 1943, and then an order came down to basically pull them from tank regiments, which happened in November. So your tank regiments would get rid of their light tanks. But artillery, self-propelled gun, other units would keep using light tanks extensively throughout 1944 and 45. And it was a good little tank. It had relatively low silhouette, relatively quiet design. And this gun, while at range, maybe it wasn't great at taking out heavy German armor. Up close, especially if it could get a side shot, it could even damage or even take out a Panther. Certainly a Panzer III or Panzer IV. Although I wouldn't want to go up against a King Tiger. But there are weird stories and incidences where a T-70 would hold up an entire German armored column, even taking out much bigger tanks. It could definitely punch above its weight class. So really, it being taken out of production wasn't a reflection on the design itself, so much as just the whole light tank concept in general. That said, the T-70, they would build over 8,200 between mid-late 1942 and the end of 1943. A huge number, so they would stay in Red Army service, even if in more second-line guard, patrol, training roles, until 1948. So they would outlast the war by some. And it really was the ultimate culmination of the whole series here. And it would actually be Russia's last light tank, at least until the PT-76 came along over a decade later. But that's a story for another day. In addition to being replaced on the battlefield by improving medium tanks like the T-34, the evolution of the self-moving gun artillery piece also kind of put an end to the light tank. In fact, this here, the Su-76, is actually built on the same chassis and general system as the T-70. And we'll talk more about it and other anti-tank and self-propelled artillery pieces in a different video. Also, armored vehicles like the BA-64 would kind of take over the light tank role to some extent. So all in all, it just got replaced. But yeah, I mean, over 5,000 of one, 8,000 of another. You know, all told, over 15,000 of these were built. Nowhere near the number of T-34s, but not insignificant and worth remembering for various reasons. And it's kind of evolution from amphibious tank to infantry support tank. Now, there was a T-50, but that was a different design lineage. It was intended to replace the T-26 and other light infantry support tanks, but they only made a few. It was just too complicated. So much like with the T-40 here, it got the kibosh put on it when the Germans came in. But unlike the T-40 that would be adapted, the T-50 was pretty much a dead-end design, if also kind of cool. So let me know what you think. I definitely want to talk about other tanks besides the T-34 because that wasn't the only thing Russia had in the war. With that, I greatly appreciate you hanging out with me. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And all that good stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.